What actually happened in 2020 and beyond? How was it possible that so many draconian anti-constitutional measures were enforced and so many obediently complied? Oxford-educated scholar and award-winning senior lecturer at Lincoln University, David Hughes, put forward a highly original, insightful, confronting, and thorough analysis of the COVID era in his new book, COVID-19, Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy. We are going to discuss this book today. David, welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation.
So before we dive into the content of the book, I want to ask you, and perhaps this is very cynical, but I was so surprised, how were you able to write this kind of book from an academic position?
Yeah, I get that a lot. And the question itself is quite revealing because it displays an awareness among many people that academia is severely limited or incapacitated when it comes to asking questions that would genuinely speak truth to power. The classic example, to my mind, is Building 7 on 9/11, a very clear and obvious case. And academics simply haven't touched it. Very few exceptions in over 20 years. So that's very interesting. It tells us something about the sociology of knowledge and of the profession. So how was I able to do it? Well, it seems to me, unlike almost the rest of the entirety of the academic community, I tried. I just simply went through the correct processes and procedures. I did what I'm supposed to do as an academic. I put forward the book proposal for peer review. It was double peer reviewed and accepted. And I followed up on what I'd proposed to do. It then went through a clearance read, got a glowing third review at that stage. It passed all of the quality control checks at Palgrave, which is a respected publisher. And in a sense, there's nothing that should be abnormal or unusual about that. That's how it's supposed to go. But the question is interesting because a lot of people understand that this is something very rare, in fact, to have this kind of work as an academic work. So that probably says more about the profession than it does about me.
So because I also thought when reading this, of course, there is the analysis, the context itself, but in terms of content, you go through this whole COVID era and are reminded following this news on a day-to-day basis, but then you're just in the stream of the news and you put it in context, text, but also in a historical line with all the references. So that makes it so, I thought this is how academics should be.
Yeah.
Because if you have just an article, because I'm a reporter, so I only have usually one page to say something. So you have all these different stories, and it's difficult for people to build a map or to have the whole view. And yeah, you really did a good job. For me, it was also helpful to see this again. Yeah.
Thanks. And that should be the responsibility of intellectuals, to use Noam Chomsky's phrase. The kind of work we do is different from journalistic work. It moves slower. It's more careful. It's more patient. Academics pride themselves on their rigor in investigating things. So, yeah, this book has come along later than other critical challenges that we've seen in the journalistic sphere, but that's to be expected. Now, I would like to see more academics doing this kind of work because, in my opinion, the content that we're dealing with could not be of any greater political significance.
Mm-hmm.
And it really does require intellectuals to apply their skills to actually try and make sense of what it is that we've just lived through. And I think what we've been largely missing is the kind of bigger picture.
Yes.
You know, what this fundamentally was. The world didn't just suddenly lose its mind.
No.
Things just didn't suddenly just go crazy for no reason.
Mm-hmm.
It's all very systematic. It's all very planned.
Because that brings me to the content of your book. So your central thesis is you analyze what happened in the COVID era in terms of a class relations, a class war of the very few against the the rest of us, the people. And in that sense, you build upon the work of Kees van Pijl in the states of emergencies. And this war is waged to keep the people in check by imposing technocracy. And what you add to this analysis is that because this war is being fought by covert means, because it's being fought by very few against many, it's a covert war, and it uses psychological operations, social engineering. And these technologies have been developed over more than 100 years. So that would be kind of this summary, and then let's start to unpack that. So starting with the class relations, can you explain what you mean by a class war? Because I think most of us are not used to thinking in these kind of Marxist terms.
Yeah, and that's for a reason, particularly after 5 decades now of the prevalence of neoliberalism. It drives any real understanding of Marxism out. And today we're just left with empty stereotypes about Marxism. I can't stand these kind of cliches that I hear about, the World Economic Forum, it's just a Marxist organization. And it couldn't be more opposite to that. The World Economic Forum is about controlling and coordinating capitalist interests against the working class. It's not for the working class. So the idea of class conflict is something which, it's a discourse which is barely spoken anymore, and it's been gradually kind of excised from academia as well over the course of many decades. But nevertheless, I think that the fundamental truths of Marxism, as properly understood, and again, without falling into stereotypes about, Marxism automatically leads to Stalinism, Marxism is totalitarian dictatorship. These are all grotesque caricatures of Marx and Engels' original work. So, if you take the Marxist premise that all history is fundamentally the history of class conflict, well, there's your starting point right there. So I think what we're seeing now is a globalized version of this. And yeah, I build on Kees's work, as you say. We're dealing with a global population that has grown from approximately 1.5 billion in 1950 to approximately 8 billion today. So that's more than a 5-fold increase. We're also at the tail end now of a decade, 2 decades of austerity in the West and beyond, which has left many people poor. We're dealing with record levels of inequality when you look at the top 1%, the top 0.1%, the top 0.001%, and so on. There's almost an exponential curve upwards as you approach the very richest in the world. And they've managed to cream off most of the world's wealth and income for themselves, particularly in the last 30 years or so. So what this has led to is a state now where it's a terribly lopsided oligarchic capitalism, to use something like Kees's phrase. It's a system which is no longer sustainable. And one of the good things about Kees's book, States of Emergency, is it highlights the large levels of global protests in 2019. So this was across 35 different countries. It's about 1 in 5. And we're talking mass protests. This is a very significant moment. We also saw a crisis in the international monetary and financial system that year. I write about that in terms of a BlackRock report. And I also talk in the book about the Western propaganda system going into crisis, because more and more people are refusing to believe everything that the television tells them anymore. And you put all of these things together, and the mechanisms for social control appear heavily undermined. And as Giorgio Agamben wrote in 2020, it's clear now that the paradigm for control, as it has existed for many decades, is no longer fit for purpose, and a new paradigm is needed. And that new paradigm, as far as I can tell, is global technocracy and a kind of bio-digital form of totalitarianism. So that's what they're trying to transfer society onto. Now, that's not something that you can just do overnight. And when you're talking about remaking society from the top down in this manner, well, previously such enormous projects have required war. And so what I think is taking place is that World War III effectively began in 2020. It looks nothing like the two previous world wars. And after all, World War II looked nothing like World War I. You see new tactics, new methods, new arms, new strategies, etc. And I refer to this war as an omni-war. In other words, what I mean by that is it's a war which is being waged by the transnational ruling class, a very small percentage of humanity, against the rest of humanity through the means of production that it owns. Has control of the money supply of the mainstream media, etc., etc. And what has happened over many decades, since at least the late 1940s, is that what I call the transnational deep state has formed behind the scenes, and this is really the instrument for waging this war. So the war is taking place across every conceivable aspect of human life now. Psychological warfare, for sure, information warfare, economic warfare, attempts possibly to manipulate the human genome. And what most people don't understand and really need to understand is that they are undeclared, unwitting combatants in this war. This is a war for their bodies and their minds, their existence, that they are now caught up in, like it or not. So I think that's, in a nutshell, the kind of the big picture of what's going on here.
So you mentioned since the 40s latest that this transnational deep state developed. Can you explain more what you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is something that I get into in my next book, which will be out on the 4th of June, called Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State. For anyone wanting to see an earlier article-length version of that book, you can access my paper in Propaganda in Focus of the same name from July 2022, so Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State. And the argument made in that paper is that what the ruling class transnationally is attempting to do now is to collapse liberal democracy and replace it with global technocracy, which is a form of totalitarianism. Now, when you go back to the 1930s, you can see that Wall Street was really rather keen on totalitarianism. It was funding the Soviet Union, it was funding Nazi Germany. There was the business plot in the United States in 1933, which, had it been successful, would have made the United States fascist. And of course, from a ruling class perspective, totalitarianism...
Explain that. I don't think that most of our listeners are familiar with the business plots.
Right, okay. So this was in 1933, also into 1934, I think. And it was financed by some of the United States' wealthiest businessmen and industrialists. And again, the idea was to overthrow democracy in the United States and to turn the United States fascist. These men approached a general called Smedley Butler, a very renowned military figure in the United States, who had done a lot of Wall Street's dirty work previously in his career, when enforcing dollar diplomacy, for example, in Latin American countries. However, Butler had got wise to the error of his ways and what was going on. He famously said war is a racket, and he refused to lead this coup attempt in 1933, the so-called business plot. And because of that, it failed. But if you think about it, it's quite scary, because if the United States had joined Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union on the path to totalitarianism, it's hard to see really how the world would have resisted going in that totalitarian direction.
Because you call all three corporate socialism, and also Roosevelt's New Deal. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, well, that's not my phrase. That's the phrase of Anthony Sutton, in his book on the relationship, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. It's called, first written in the 1970s, buried for many decades, and recently resurrected and reprinted, I think, around 2012 or so. So the idea is that these very powerful financiers, what is in their interests is not actually laissez-faire capitalism at all. It's a form of collectivism, which Sutton calls corporate socialism. So in other words, if you can have vast industries, say the electric industry in the Soviet Union, and you can create massive oligopolies within those industries. And as the financiers, you finance that.
Mm-hmm.
You essentially take control over the entire economy. It's almost impossible to challenge that. Mm-hmm. So that really was very much the model which was being applied. And of course, it didn't ultimately succeed because of World War II and so on. But we should be very clear about this, that some of the most powerful people in the world, and we go back to the so-called robber barons, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the DuPonts, later Ford, and so on. These very powerful American families continued to exert their influence all the way through to the present day, really. I mean, when you look at the continued influence of the Rockefeller Foundation, it's absolutely extraordinary. So when you understand the character of those foundations and you look back at their earlier history and what it is that they are seeking to do, total social control is what they crave. And they have been seeking this and planning this for a very long time. Mm-hmm. And as I argue in the book, I think really the kind of 1968 moment, a moment of kind of mass unrest transnationally, made very clear to the transnational ruling class that it really has to act as one across the different countries. So no surprise after that we see organizations like the Trilateral Commission and the World Economic Forum coming to being in the early 1970s. And ever since then, they've clearly been scheming ways of obtaining the kind of control that they seek, because if they can't get it, there's always the risk of revolution. There's always the risk that they will be overthrown. And as I said earlier, with an increasingly growing and restive global population, that risk mounts with every passing day.
So how does this relate to the transnational deep state? Because the World Economic Forum and the UN is, of course, a global platform. Those are kind of the overt part of this, but you see the transnational deep state as having a big role in this as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're looking at a very complex network here, and I think the intelligence agencies are at the heart of it. The major philanthropic foundations also factor in. We talk about it sometimes in terms of what Benet's called the invisible government, but actually, as Mike Lofgren has pointed out, not all of it is invisible. Sometimes you can point to some of the key actors quite clearly. When you look at the pronouncements, for example, of Mark Carney in the financial sphere, or the heads of Goldman Sachs, for example. I mean, it's clear that these characters are part of this. But I think more fundamentally, what the COVID crisis revealed was a level of systematic planning that can only have been possible through decades of premeditation. And that's one of the things I tried to get across in the book, how deliberate, how systematic, how carefully schemed all of this abuse was. And in chapter 8, I also talk about it's not my phrase, but the IT bio-nano era was a phrase used in one of the key planning documents back in 2002. And it was anticipating 2020, 2025, 2030 as pushing the world into this IT bio-nano era. Now, there is so much evidence, we won't have time to get into it here, but there is so much evidence that this is now starting to emerge, that also, the planning for that also goes back a minimum of 2 decades. So again, all of this has to be clandestine. All of it has to be layered in levels of deceit and psychological warfare such that most people would not even begin to imagine it. But that's how it has to be if you have a small, tiny minority, really, of humanity trying to subjugate and enslave the rest. We have the numbers on our side, but they have the means of production and decades of advanced planning and all of this very kind of nefarious scheming on their side. So the truth, unfortunately, is very ugly. The idea that we find ourselves in a war that we didn't ask for, that no one has told us that we're in, and the purpose of the war is to enslave us. I mean, this is horrific. It's really awful. But that, I think, is what's going on. And it's better to face evil squarely and head on and be honest about what's happening and transparent than to bury heads in the sand and look away.
Well, talking about this evil, because it was so odd that all these measures, such as masking and lockdowns and distancing and using a non-diagnostic test for cases which are not sick people, all these things, there was no scientific proof, even in 2020, or even evidence for harm. But what you show and document so well is that the effects of all these types of interventions have been highly studied, but not in terms of health, but in terms of social engineering, psychological warfare. So I thought to make it very concrete and make people see that how long this research dates back and that they knew very well the psychological effects of all these measures. Can we go through some of them? For example, you discussed the Tavistock Institute. What is their work? Yeah, what were they focused on?
Shock and stress are the two key ideas here. So one of the things that emerged from World War I was the phenomenon of shell shock. And what psychiatrists realized very quickly was that soldiers who had suffered shell shock were much more malleable and psychologically. So this is a key principle which has gone all the way through to the present. And the key mediating influence in that has been the Tavistock Institute, which was set up in London just after World War One, and you can trace its influence through characters such as John Rawlings Rees, who increasingly over time looked for ways of exploiting a state of shock, not merely within individuals, but within societies at large. And they came up with the idea in the 1960s. They called it social turbulence. And the idea is if you can kind of create a rolling series of shocks and crises, for example, the oil price shock in the early 1970s and then the various kind of terrorist shocks that were being inflicted. Public didn't know then, but through the Operation Gladio kind of false flag terrorism network transnationally, that what it does is it keeps the population constantly kind of on edge and off guard and much more susceptible to the influence of propaganda. So Naomi Klein gets into this to some extent in her book, The Shock Doctrine, which she recognizes that she frames it in terms of neoliberalism and disaster capitalism. But she recognizes that the kinds of techniques which are used to inflict this shock on a social, society-wide level can in fact be traced back to the CIA's MK-Ultra experiments in the 1950s. So when we bring that up to the present day, clearly these kinds of techniques were in use on 9/11, for example, a moment of extreme shock for all of us, a great kind of social rupture. 45 seconds after the second tower was hit, the media was planting the suggestion it was Osama bin Laden. This is how it works. You can insert these key kind of trigger words and messages and images at the moment of shock. In the COVID case, the lockdowns were the mechanism of shock. And it involves certain mechanisms such as isolation, defamiliarization, creating a strange and unreal kind of reality. But these principles you can trace all the way back for a
What
good
is
100 years.
defamiliarization?
Sorry.
What is defamiliarization? I read the book, but
Yeah,
for the audience.
it's right. So it's taking the world which was familiar and comfortable and homely,
Mm-hmm.
and turning it upside down so that it becomes the opposite. It becomes something strange, uncanny, threatening, unfamiliar, and a very uneasy place to be.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, when you have people wandering around en masse in face masks, standing on these ridiculous stickers on the ground, performing the most absurd kind of behaviors, it takes what people previously had experienced as a relatively normal sense of reality
Mm-hmm.
and turns the entire social environment into something grotesque and surreal. And that has a psychologically unsettling and disturbing effect on people. And that's just one of many parts of this psychological operation.
Because you mentioned the Tavistock and MK Ultra, because I was surprised to read that even Cameron, who is of course well known for the MK Ultra experiments, that he comes from Tavistock.
There are links all over the place when you get into it. And again, I just mentioned in this context, Rockefeller.
Mm-hmm.
The Rockefeller family was doing most of the funding for this. They funded John Rawlings Rees, who was friends with, I think his name was Brock Chisholm, the first director of the WHO.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this went hand in hand. The kind of use of psychiatry for purposes of social control is also important here. So many people like to think of the psychiatric profession as kind of doing good and healing and so on. But when you trace the origins of that profession, it actually goes back to some quite dark ideas about controlling the minds of the population through various means. So it's all pretty troubling to look into.
So it's basically weaponized psychiatry, or it was weaponized to start with.
It seems that way. I mean, that's essentially what I argue in chapter 2 of the book. Yeah.
So you also talk about the trauma-based mind control and how what was learned from that type of, like, the most horrendous type of mind control, how that was applied in this COVID era.
Yeah, that's probably the most unsettling chapter in the book, chapter 3. And again, it goes back to the MK Ultra experiments, and the idea that if you do really awful things to people, if you torture them, if you make them inflict pain on others, or maybe even kill others, that they become tremendously susceptible to programming. So, yeah, I mean, the idea of torture, most people think of torture as, I don't know, the rack in medieval times, physical forms of torture,
Mm-hmm.
stretching people out and so on. Well, it's been known for centuries that form of torture is completely unreliable and ineffective if you're trying to get information reliably out of someone. What became clear through the MK Ultra experiments is that the most effective forms of torture are in fact psychological, and they can involve certain means such as self-inflicted pain coupled with sensory deprivation. Those were two of the key elements that came out of the MK Ultra program. And when you look at what happened during COVID, if you look back at the Amnesty International reports from the 1970s on torture, they talk about the idea of chronic stress and how the torturer seeks to place the subject, the victim, into a state of chronic stress. Again, to be able to just control the victim entirely. And when you look at what happened during the COVID era and the amounts of stress that were created, and I cite Dennis Rancourt's work in this regard because he deals precisely with stress as a key factor. He's looking at data from the United States. Mm-hmm. For him, the all-cause mortality is best explained in terms of various factors which impact upon stress and cause chronic stress. So I don't believe that this is by accident. I think that the infliction of chronic stress across society was done on purpose. And then, other very troubling questions to ask. When have entire groups of people ever been required to wear blue surgical face masks before? So, there was the original SARS outbreak in 2003, where many people in East Asia opted to wear the mask. I don't believe it was actually mandated to do so. It just shows how quickly these kinds of norms can catch on, no matter how unscientific. Yes, surgeons, for example, required to wear masks, but not to stop viral transmission or anything like this. The really troubling one for me is the only other time I can find of this people being forced to wear these things is Guantanamo Bay in 2002, in the early stages of the War on Terror, where the inmates there are forced to wear these masks. And you might think, oh, well, it's just a coincidence, maybe it's for the health of the guards or something, these inmates have just been flown in. No, because actually when you look at the photos, there are other photos of the inmates wearing, for example, industrial kind of ear protectors, thick, heavy gloves on their hands, all known means of sensory deprivation, which again go back to MKUltra and CIA torture techniques. And we know that Guantanamo Bay is a torture facility. So what on earth are face masks doing at this torture facility? And in one of the photos, the inmates are not wearing, the gloves and the headgear and all of the rest of it. They're simply wearing the masks, the face masks. So that tells me that there is something about these masks which is bound up in decades of research into psychological torture. And, I talk about the kind of self-inflicted guilt. And one of the things you find in the torture manuals is that one of the most effective ways of torturing a person is to make them do things to themselves. So if you just say, right, go and stand over there on that stool, and then you leave them there, that's all you've done. You haven't touched them, you haven't said anything else, but they're too frightened to get off the stool. And they stand there and they stand there and they stand there, and effectively they're doing it to themselves. They could easily just step down, no one's stopping them. And it's kind of true with the masks as well. And that's just a kind of expectation that you should wear these things. But they were clearly experienced as oppressive and uncomfortable. Many people would kind of wear them under the nose or under the chin. Obviously, the kind of the bacteria that gathers between the mouth and the mask and is then re-inhaled. These things, I call them a filthy habit because they really are. And that's just the physical function. Then there's also the psychological function of the mask, because it stops people from seeing each other's faces. So it's really profoundly dehumanizing in that respect. They serve a kind of a cult function as well. When everybody's wearing them, it's a kind of a form of cult behavior and indoctrination. Historically, masks have been associated with slavery and sadomasochism. In films, the kinds of characters that wear masks, villains like Bane. These things are really grotesque. They're really sick, physically and psychologically. And yet they were presented as a public health means. Now, when you start to understand the extreme levels of deception which took place as part of the psychological operation, and you reinterpret everything not as a public health crisis, but as military measures taken against the population to intimidate and cow and train and indoctrinate the population as the opening kind of campaign in what I call the war for technocracy, instituting this new kind of totalitarian system. When you see it that way, these things are very, very dark, and I think they are indeed bound up with methods of trauma-based mind control. One other thing, sorry, just on this is the idea of killing Granny.
Yes.
Again, when you look back to the MKUltra experiments, and indeed allegations of, for example, satanic ritual abuse, which I also discuss, although they're hard to prove, the idea of making people feel responsible or killing a loved one apparently is one of the most effective means of traumatizing them. So there were some people in the population who honestly thought that they might die or they might kill someone else if they came within 6 feet of another person. I had one student who believed that she had in fact killed her grandmother because she went home for Christmas in 2020, 2021, and the grandmother just happened to die at that time. I mean, this is dreadful. These are awful means of making people feel responsible for killing others. So this kind of killing granny propaganda, which was very prevalent here in the UK.
Here too.
It's not something which can properly be justified in terms of behavioral psychology and getting the public to behave, in inverted commas, responsibly. No, this is something much, much darker, and it's really designed to interfere with the minds of the public in a very dark way.
Because also we had a slogan that was that if you hug your mother or your grandmother, you might kill her. Yeah. And then I thought, if you're in a state of stress, and especially as a child, the thing that calms your nervous system down is physical proximity. It's a hug. That's what. So suddenly that becomes low. Your need to calm down turns into your fear of killing the one you love most. So that was so deeply evil, I thought, even back then. Yeah, without.
It was, yeah. The whole thing was just deeply evil, and everything, of course, was inverted. And so, you know, some people ask, well, you know, why was it such a crazy time? You know, why did people lose their minds and so on?
Mm-hmm.
That was the whole intention. The whole intention was what Joost Meerlo back in 1956 called the rape of the mind, menticide. And again, this is known in psychological warfare and again through the MKUltra experiments, that if you can break down the mind, you mentioned Ewan Cameron earlier, he came up with the concept of de-patterning the mind. So you take everything that's, you know, familiar and normal about the mind's usual functioning, and you stop it and you de-pattern it. And then you can, as Orwell wrote, true power lies in being able to piece back those parts of the mind in the way that you desire. Mm-hmm. So volume 1 of this book really is all about the menticide. It's all about the attempts to disrupt the mind. Volume 2 will be more focused on the programming elements, kind of hypnosis and indoctrination and obedience training and so on. But first you have to de-pattern the mind, and volume 1 deals with so many different techniques for doing so.
Yes, because I would like to add to that, a discussion can never fully cover it, but this book meticulously lays it out, all these methods that have been developed and how they've been applied during the COVID era. And it's very difficult to refute because it's so academically well referenced. And you write very well, because sometimes, even though academic literature, like, you get all the content, but you have to wrestle through it. And here, this was not the case at all. It's very, very readable. So
thanks. I appreciate that. And yeah, in terms of the referencing, I tried to back up every single claim with a reference. There are thousands of references in this book. In total, forget the number, but it's like 80, 100 pages or something just of references in total. And those references include something like 130 or 140 DOI.org references, which are proper peer-reviewed academic literature. And they also include a lot of books as well, proper academic books. So, yeah, so I've done my best to kind of lend the weight of some kind of academic imprimatur to this. As I say, it passed at least 3 peer reviews in total with the publisher. And it also attracted £14,000 of open access funding, which is how I was able to make it freely available to everyone. So again, that's a sign that people, the funders saw this as something of value. So there are kind of lots of kind of external stamps of approval, as it were, before it went out there. It did pass various kind of key tests, I think. So hopefully your audience will understand the value of that, because in a sense I see my role as doing something fairly unique, because academics are too afraid or too brainwashed to touch what they call conspiracy theories, just blindly using the propaganda term, heavily propagandize themselves. This work tends not to get done. And then where people are looking into these issues, they tend not to have the kind of academic training to be able to write it up in this way.
Yes.
So I'm kind of trying to bring the two things together and really make the case that, some of these ideas which are dismissed as wild and crazy and conspiracy theory and so on, actually they're not. There's a ton of evidence to support them.
Well, yeah, and you document it very well. So I want to go to one of the theories that has been put forward to explain what happened in 2020 that a lot of people latched onto is the so-called mass formation theory of Matthias Desmet.
Yep.
You've been very vocal about that you don't agree with this. And yeah, can you add a little bit about that?
No, it's absolute garbage. It's plagiarized. The concept of mass formation is plagiarized from Freud, as far as I can tell. For anyone who wants to see the full detail of that, please read my co-authored paper called Global Class War and the Politics of a Hatchet Job, and look at section 3. The idea of mass formation itself, it's completely outdated intellectually. I mean, it goes back 100 years. It's not at all up to date with modern developments in psychology. Only 1/3 of Desmet's book actually addresses the COVID era. He doesn't touch things like vaccine damage or any of the kind of atrocities that have taken place. The name Joost Meerlo is absent from his book, so there's nothing in there about totalitarian menticide. And as the Briggins argued before I and my co-authors did, the fundamental purpose or effect of Desmet's work here is to exonerate perpetrators and essentially to blame the public for its own kind of psychological failings and deficiencies, and to say, oh, we must always kind of look at ourselves. And it completely misses the fact that the largest psychological warfare operation in history has just been waged against us. So if you expect me to look at his book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, and think that it's some kind of wonderful explanation of what happened psychologically during COVID, I'm afraid it really isn't. And to me, it looks very much, particularly in terms of the ways it's been so heavily promoted. He's enjoyed lots of kind of propaganda support on this from various key figures. He's had, slick kind of documentaries made about him and his work. The fact it's being so heavily promoted suggests to me that it's precisely to divert and deflect attention from the kinds of issues that I'm looking at, where the truth really lies. So, yeah, I don't have any time really for Desmet's work.
Because a central tenet for him is also that there's this mass anxiety and fear within the population, as if that's just something natural that comes up. And what I always thought is their big fear machine has been turned on. We've been terrorized. So you can't say that, and not just with COVID, also but war on terror and in so many ways. So you cannot say that there is kind of free-floating anxiety as a natural phenomenon.
That's right. There's no real agency or perpetrators in Desmet's work. Things just happen. It's just part of modern life that we have free-floating anxiety. I think he names 4 factors in total, and then they can just somehow spontaneously come together, and then the next thing you know, everyone's losing their minds and walking around wearing masks. And I mean, it's just absolute nonsense, isn't it? It's complete nonsense. And yes, there is tons of anxiety and fear in society. Why? Because the media washes society in that relentlessly, 24/7, and has done since at least 9/11. I mean, even going back into the Cold War and the nuclear threat and so on. This is the whole point. If you can keep societies fearful and anxious, you render them more susceptible to propaganda and social control. It's actually quite a crude and simple formula. Most people don't realize it, but this is precisely how it's done.
Exactly. So, and the other part is you like if you look at in terms of class war, and that this very very few owns the means of production, and the rest of us kind of hang by our fingertips, and because you cannot even support a family for one income, you need people to work. So this lack of security, and I think also by undermining ownership, property rights, also causes anxiety. So that's the other part, kind of like the basis of your existence is always at the risk of these large international forces like the financial system or the global economy.
Yeah, and as I say, I don't believe that the inflation which has been taking place is accidental. I don't believe that it's driven by the war in Ukraine. If you look at some of the BlackRock documents from before COVID, they knew very well that if you make the kinds of changes to the international monetary and financial system that they're proposing, it will generate inflation. And inflation has been a tool previously in terms of the shock doctrine. And, in Chile, for example, in 1973, the coup there was rapidly followed up by a period of high inflation. And Chile was used as the first kind of test country, as it were, for rolling out neoliberal economics. So again, all of these things go hand in hand. When you understand that, you see that we are dealing with a transnational deep state here, which is extremely powerful and is now using every means at its disposal, and I mean every means, to attack the population in an attempt to ultimately enslave it.
Exactly, because so a while ago, I interviewed Naomi Wolf about her book Facing the Beast, and she is a very good, eloquent writer. It's an excellent book. But while reading it, I felt frustrated. And the reason why was when I was a teenager in high school, you had to read all these books about the Second World War. So I knew these types of books, and you remember the discussions. How was it possible that people behaved this way? What would I do in that circumstance? And I could kind of like visualize people 30 years ahead or 50 years ahead and reading her book and saying, oh, how was this possible? And I just thought, so one question I wanted to ask her, but the discussion took a completely different direction, was like, what do we fail to learn? And you actually answer the question in your book. So you cite Van Mierlo and say, the real lesson from Nazi Germany is that mass delusion can be induced. It is simply a question of organizing and manipulating collective feelings in a proper way. And I really believe your book is a super important historical record in this regard, because it shows both the methods and how they've been applied. And this new war is not just a war for territory as we've been used to as how we think of war, but it's the war for the mind. And that's why we should really become acquainted with the weapons that are being waged against us. And you really give it as a head start. So besides from reading your book, what are other things that you think people should do or can do to drive this into a different direction?
Get rid of their smartphones would be my number one tip, and reject all forms of smart technology, because the fundamental premise here is that the ultimate goal, I believe, is to connect human bodies to an external network of some kind, which will allow everybody to be monitored at all times, potentially even down to the levels of their individual organ activities. There'll be no privacy of any kind. They're openly declaring that they want to develop technologies that are capable of reading people's thoughts. They want absolute control directly over our bodies. So just as BlackRock produced its plan to, quote, go direct in control over the monetary supply, there also, in my opinion, is a clear plan to gain direct control over human bodies. And, once you can do that, it is a form of complete and total enslavement. You can get people to do anything you want. The whole kind of Hunger Games society comes into view at that point. So how is this possible? It's only possible if this network is allowed to be built in the first place, and it's all reliant on biodigital means and smart technologies. The whole idea of technocracy requires being able to monitor everyone and everything: kettles, toasters, cars, lampposts, smart cities, smart meters. All of this they want to link together. They're claiming that we need the 5G network, or maybe the 6G network, to be able to support all of this. But what is the true purpose of all of this technology? It's totalitarian biodigital control. So I think the faster people realize that smart really means dumb. It really means too stupid to see that these shiny, lovely technologies, which make life so easy and so convenient, are actually there ultimately as a means of enslavement. I think just realizing a very simple principle like that and resisting everything smart would go a very long way to derailing these kinds of agendas, because again, it's everywhere. The central bank, digital currencies, similar kind of principle. The government or the federal bank will have control directly over your money and with it over your lives. So, dissident opinion won't be allowed because dissidents won't be allowed access to their money, or the spending of that money will be made conditionally. This whole technocratic control grid that is coming into place is a direct threat to human freedom. And again, it's not being done by accident. And if this architecture of oppression is allowed to reach maturity, then it will indeed allow a tiny cabal of vicious, psychopathic technocrats to gain total control over all of our lives. So people need to realize this, and they need to find whatever means of resistance they can. And again, it's going to be different for different people. Kind of done what I can in terms of the kind of academic sphere, and you're kind of doing what you can do in terms of the journalistic sphere and so on. But the point that I always make is that everybody can do something. Everybody can do something. So just look for what it is that you can do, and take responsibility for pushing back with this, because mass non-compliance ultimately renders these agendas unenforceable.
Exactly. Oh, I would like to add to that. Right now, a lot of cities are building out the smart city infrastructure, and people are just not engaged with their local governments. And this is one of the points where I see that there's a lot of opportunity to push back, because a lot of us have petitioned the national government, and this all falls on deaf ears. But the local government, you can talk to your representatives and still have a personal connection, and you can even put yourself up for election. Because as a journalist, I talk to a lot of people who say, I saw what was happening in 2020, and I thought this is time to really to do something, and they ran for election. So for everyone it's something different, and even it's something as simple as just keep paying cash. So
I agree, and the local level is really important in all of this. And in the UK, there's been some quite interesting and successful local resistance in places like Oxford, which are trying to turn into a 15-minute city, or Colchester, and people are starting to mobilise around some of these issues now, and take quite direct action in terms of going to council meetings and listening in and holding the representatives there to account. And once more and more people understand what's at stake and take these kinds of actions, it's going to be a lot harder to enforce them.
Yes. Good. So if people want to read your book, where can they go?
Okay, so for the book, the quickest way is probably just to do a search for the term War for Technocracy. And at the moment, the first search result that comes up is the Springer website, where you can download the whole book for free. You can also download the book for free from my academia.edu site, which is ulincoln, all one word, ulincoln.academia.edu/David Hughes/books. What I would say is the book was 3 years of very hard work, intellectually and emotionally, and I've managed to make it available for free to everybody, but I don't actually receive a penny in terms of royalties or fees or any of that. I'm also in a precarious position at the moment where, because of a round of redundancies that's been announced at my university, there's 220 jobs at risk. So there is a realistic possibility here that I might lose my job. So if anybody can support my work, I would urge them please to give something back if you found something of value in this book. Simple means of doing so is buy me a coffee, buymeacoffee.com/DA Hughes. There's other means of support I've included in a document on my academia.edu site. And I would also ask if there's anybody out there who is interested in helping to fund the completion of volume 2 of this book, to please get in touch with me. As I say, if I do end up losing my job in the next few weeks, then unless I can get public financial support to continue doing this work, I'm going to have to change careers, I think, and do something else, and this research will come to a stop. But volume 2 is already underway. I already know exactly where it's going to go. I've already done a lot of the research for it. So again, if people can help make that book a reality through financial support, I'd be extremely grateful.
David, thank you so much for your work and sharing your knowledge for this interview. And
You're most welcome.
Yeah, I wish you so much luck. And please, everyone, make sure that his research gets funded, because this is such an important book and we need to see this sequel as well. So and do share it round as well, because of course the social media platforms are already shadow banning the hell out of it. So yes. One of the advantages of having it available as a single downloadable PDF is that you can email it round as well. Mm-hmm. Don't just be reliant on social media. Try and spread this around in other ways if you can. I will share it in my newsletter. Thanks, I appreciate that. Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you.